Well, thank you and good afternoon. Now, for the next around 40 minutes, we're going to take you on a little excursion with us all the way up to space. And of course, just to set the scene, for centuries, if we're thinking about it, space has been the domain of superpowers and some of us dreamers. But what is really happening is there's a race to space. And there's a race to space and a race to access within space and a race to ownership within space. And ultimately what that means is that space has become an economic, a technological, but also a political and somewhat of a military battleground. And I'm going to call it battleground because it is really competitive. And so the ownership or the outcome of this will reshape ultimately the status quo of geopolitics here on Earth. So right now, just to throw a couple of stats at you before we get started, there are thousands of satellites in lower orbit. In and around 20,000, out of those 10,000 are in operation, and half of those are owned by one single private company. And that is, of course, SpaceX's Starlink that we all very well know. Now, low Earth is becoming increasingly privatized. It is becoming increasingly commercial. And this, of course, raises questions about ownership, security, sovereignty, and overall access. And then if we go further, we have the moon, we have Mars, and we have anything far and beyond and in between. And the lunar economy alone is projected to be worth around 500 billion by 2040. So just for reference, that is the size of a small to medium European country like Denmark or Sweden. So there's competition over resources. This becomes an energy play. This becomes a play about access. Just for reference, your GPS in the cars, it's all satellite linked. Making sure we all get and find our way home, it's all satellite linked. So new geopolitical front lines are where it's at, and that is really why we should all care about space. And that is why we're going to have this conversation. So I'm very excited. We have brilliant women on this panel. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Ritu Karidhal. She's the senior scientist in India Space Research Organization. She is lovingly referred to as the rocket woman of India. So just throwing that out there. And has, of course, for everyone who knows her, she's been instrumental in realizing the Mars orbiter mission, and of course also the Chandrayaan 2 and 3 missions, where she has been the mission director and really successfully landing and supporting India's lunar South Pole landing. Now we have Jessie Kate with us. Jessie Kate Schingler is the co-founder of Open Lunar Foundation. So she really is an expert when it comes to all matters lunar law and governance of Great Commons. And Sarah Sabri, who is an astronaut and CEO of Deep Space Initiative, not just any astronaut, but the first ever Egyptian astronaut, the first female Arab woman who has landed on space, and the first woman from the African continent. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with you, Jessie Kate. Why should we care? What are the geopolitics of space?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Well, first, I just want to say thanks to World Minds and to Racina for having me. It's my first time at the conference. It's been really interesting to be here. We have been talking about the 3 pillars of this conference of peace, of people, and planet. And I think that's a good reference point for thinking about why space matters to us at this conference. Peace and security on Earth are deeply facilitated by space, but space also helps us to understand our changing planet on a daily basis, and it helps us to provide basic services to people in their day-to-day lives. So I think we can separate space into our space activities into space-to-space activities and space-to-Earth activities. And when we talk about geopolitics or astropolitics, as we might call it in the space community, then really looking at the space-to-Earth activities is where things can get kind of interesting these days. So activities in space itself are where I'm going to focus on. So first of all, we've got environmental monitoring of the changing planet. Planetary scale phenomenon are extremely important, as we all know. Agricultural migration and deforestation, methane and carbon emissions. But Then we also can look at tactical military activities and conflicts, as we've seen very much playing out in Ukraine, from communications and internet connectivity with GNSS capabilities such as GPS systems, to positioning and targeting, to ballistic missile technology. We also have strategic peace and security being contributed to through surveillance and reconnaissance. So we talk about eyes in the sky, supporting monitoring, reporting and verification activities that are generally seen to increase stability. Space is also a dual-use technology. So launch vehicles are basically ICBMs. So the proliferation of space access is also the proliferation of missile technology that could be used as offensive capabilities. This also makes these assets a potential target in geopolitical conflicts on Earth, both to undermine military capabilities as well as to handicap an adversary's economic and civil functioning. Finally, it also means that when we see nations advancing their space capabilities, for example, what we see happening right now with lunar activities between China and the United States, part of what they're doing is they're sending signals about their ability to operate in and maneuver in the space domain, which is a signal about their ability to dominate in the terrestrial domain. So it's all very related. In recent years, we've seen an increase in this kind of posturing with anti-satellite weapons tests, so I'm just going to talk about that for a second. These are mostly kinetic space weapons, and what we see is literally some of the space superpowers are blowing up their own satellites to show that it's possible, that they could do it to other actors if they needed to, which, as we'll get into, it creates a huge mess in terms of space debris, but it also threatens their own satellites and astronauts. So the fact that they're willing to do that, it really shows us how important that posturing is to them, to be able to demonstrate that capability.
Jesse, thank you. And so we already, we started speaking and you just mentioned space debris. So space debris is, of course, a huge issue. I will now pass over Ritu. We also talked earlier about ultimately not just space debris, but orbital congestion. So considering how dependent we are on satellites, first of all, there's, of course, we're talking launch capabilities, but then we're also thinking how much space is there for how many more satellites and how do we ensure that we don't end up basically having disturbances here on Earth?
Yes, Gordon, it's a very relevant question. Before answering to this, I just wanted, I know a few of the audience may know about space and some of them may not. So I would like to give some, how the space looks like. As we all say, the space, belongs to no nation or no corporation. When you are on Earth, you are limited by your borders or the boundaries, and then you are a citizen of a country or like that. But when you go several kilometers above the Earth's surface, that is, let's say 500 kilometers up the Earth's surface, you start revolving around the Earth, and you belong to whole Earth. So it's like, we have to understand, when we are out of Earth, when we are higher altitudes, we go beyond the several heights of Earth's surface, it is no boundaries exist there, no borders exist there. And yes, we have to go to space because it provides you a platform, not a platform, it's a small word, but it's a big arena where you have satellites, the satellites which can reach to a place where a human being even cannot reach. See, Amazon forest, dense Amazon forest. You have to do some, study on it or learning on it. It's very difficult for a common being to go there and explore it, but from satellite you can do. It can reach to a place where a common man, it's not easy to reach there. It provides an arena to do lots and lots of, not only just scientific exploration, but currently the whole, I will say the whole humanity now depends upon the applications or services which are provided by the satellites. Today, for example, let's assume your GPS in your mobile stops working. Can you reach from a place to another place? It's very, very difficult. And not only this navigation, you talk of communication, you can go, telemedicines, and so many other, for example, a small, very a small example, I'll give the application just to the audience, just to make you more aware of how the space technology or satellite is getting used, and it's becoming a very essential part of us. Small fisherman who has to go and catch the fishes, but the data from a satellite which is having some, let's say, ocean monitor camera, it can tell the temperature of the ocean water. It can tell, where the fishes are found in abundance and where he has to go. So how he will get help out of it? Because if you tell him the correct place where to go, it will save on the time, it will save on the fuel, and then he will get more returns. It's a very simple example of utilizing space for a common man. But then when we have to reach it to, this is like technology converting into services. When you try converting technology into services, you have to scale it up at a huge level. And then where is that privatization and, private players come into picture? Then only we can make it in a big scale manufacturing, launching services, applications going to a common man. That is what the privatization is, essential part. But as Corona was telling, congestion. So what happens? If you have to, let us say, provide services, unhindered or uninterrupted services, you need more and more satellites in the space. Then it leads to what? It leads to orbital congestion. When we talk of, we have so many, everybody is having cars, and, every common man is having now. So you go on streets. Streets are a limited capacity to hold. You have a traffic congestion. Similarly, you will face a congestion which is an orbital congestion. And then there is when the services are, let us say, limited within a country or within a nation of the boundary, the private players, and there is a governing body which sees that, or the private players are also bind. They are having regulations which to follow. But then when these private players and the whole services goes across the globe. Recently we have Starlink, you would have seen that. The services are provided across the globe. Then which is the governing body, or which is the framework, common space framework, which really regulates or monitors and shows that, see, I tell you, you might have heard of, or some of you would have heard of something called Kessler syndrome. It's like if in case there congestion or anything unexpected, two satellites coming very near to each other, we constantly monitor. Currently, we constantly monitor, do the required maneuver to ensure that they don't come so near to each other, and then conjunction is avoided. But if you keep on increasing this congestion, it becomes highly difficult. So what are the guidelines?
It's a manual process, right?
Yes, when it comes to such, it's not only orbital congestion, it's like space situational awareness, how you manage the debris, if it is debris created, how to do the debris. There are lots of guidelines available, how nations should do, or how a satellite operator should monitor. But in view, when we are going to scale up by a level of thousands and more times, whether that guidelines are sufficient or they need to be strengthened, they need to be more and more enforceable. So this is what is I feel required in a global framework, to really see that we are able to sustain these activities. It should not happen that tomorrow, when we are trying to depend on it, and the sustainability is lost.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's maybe get back to legal frameworks a little bit later. But of course, and as we spoke about earlier, I mean, there's an increasing participation of private companies. We need private companies, or governments need private companies, in order to ultimately complete the space missions that they have, and the race to space. It is critical, but it's a very resource-intensive game, let's say. So, and I will come to you, Sarah, in a second, but Ritu, how and what kind of role, first of all, do you see India playing within the space industry and also within the space of working with private companies here?
Yes, India's role has been very pivotal. I will say that recently we have had a very cost-effective and very technological extensive missions. We have the Mars Orbiter mission, as you mentioned, Mangalyaan, and then the Chandrayaan-3, the first time, and both had really created history because the Mars Orbiter mission was a mission which was succeeded in its first attempt, and Chandrayaan-3, the first mission on the moon's south pole, because it is data suggests that you have lots of resources or the water presence at the poles of the moon, and then we have reached near the South Pole. So ISRO has always been working in a very cost-effective manner and, taking up challenging missions like this. And now coming to the privatization and the commercial part of it, it has opened its doors now. Earlier we were missions were limited to within the ISRO. But now the Indian government has opened the doors for the private players. We have InSpace, we have ANSYL, New Space India Limited. They all, you talk of InSpace, they all do hand-holding. They they facilitate the private players or the startups, who are capable of taking up such responsibility of making satellites or launch vehicles and then application side. So ISRO has opened up, Indian government has opened up, and for example, you take ANSYL, this New Space India Limited, the commercial part of it now is taken up by ANSYL, and the missions like Chandrayaan and Interplanetary are done by ISRO. So this has the working mode is like private public partnership, PPP mode. So, and inclusive, involving private players for the inclusive growth. And then always there is also, based on the Indian space policy, the guidelines, which always ensures that there is no, no dominance or monopoly of anything, but we all work together for inclusive growth. That is how ISRO and India has now opened up, yes.
Thank you so much. Sarah, now I want to come to you because you obviously bring a very unique perspective to this discussion. So as really the first, not just Egyptian astronaut, but also Arab woman in space, you were always passionate about space. Yet when you looked at where can you contribute and which companies can you contribute, you very quickly realized that because of your passport, you cannot contribute in the US. A lot of space initiatives and a lot of space companies also in the private sector will only employ their national fellow citizens. So what was the solution that you did about this, and how does the New Space Initiative that you work on fall into this? Thank you.
No, yes, I think it's something that I think is not really well known about space, is that I think it is well known too, and I think also Jesse talked about this a little bit briefly, is that space has a dual purpose. It can be used for both science and for humanity and for exploration, right? Like whenever you think about space, whenever you're thinking about looking up at the stars, you're thinking about this feeling of wonder, this feeling of limitlessness, right? But it also has this other side of it that is not, what it was meant to be, or what some side of it are actually meant for it to happen at the beginning. So definitely because of that, because of the fact that space can be used as a military for weaponry and for all of this, and a lot of the technologies that are developed for space are under the US munition list, for example, in the US, or protected by ITAR. It's the same thing in different countries. So every country looks at their space technologies and their space field as something that is more of national interest and that they need to be protecting it. But what we've seen throughout the years is that the demand is actually for people who are skilled, for the demand from countries, from commercial industry, because of how much it's growing. They are needing to hire more and more people, but they're not finding enough qualified applicants, because you can't just look for a specific industry. Imagine if one industry was limited to only people from within that specific nation. It doesn't really make sense, right? Because I think there's so many people around the world that bring different perspectives, and whenever you're working on a problem, you need to be addressing it from different angles. You need to be getting the people that you can get from different parts of the world to address that problem. And when we're talking about space, it is rocket science. It is some of the most difficult topics that humanity has had to deal with. So you need to be able to employ people that are that have the capacity, that have the skills to be able to work on it without looking at their passports. So for me, yes, when I started getting interested in the field, which, long story short, it was because of an existential crisis. It wasn't something that I dreamt of doing as a child because I grew up in Egypt. And there we don't have astronauts. We don't watch rocket launches on TV. You don't read about them on the newspaper. It's just something that's so far away. So for me, I got interested in the field because of astrophysics, because I had a lot of questions about the world. And for me, my solution or my conclusion to those questions that I had that's just impossible to answer was that in order for us to at least attempt to answer them is for us, if humanity become multiplanetary. So that's how it started for me. So when I started wanting to work in the field, even though my background is mechanical engineering, I worked in robotic surgery, I worked in cell cells, I worked in a lot of different fields that were very relevant to a lot of the positions that were available or a lot of the research that was being done. I wasn't allowed to even have access to the data for it. And that shows you that your passport sometimes does limit you, and it's not because those employers don't want to hire you. They do, and they're having issues with that. And we've been actually at DSI's initiative, studying that as well. We've interviewed so many different companies around the US because we're focused mostly in the US, and people are having issues hiring. And it shows you that it's growing and the demand is big, and we need to be able to, update those laws. We need to be updating this US munition list. A spacesuit should not be on this list. A piece of satellite that is being used for agriculture monitoring should not be on this list because it's benefiting everyone. And with satellite development, like we were talking about here, like my fellow panelists here, that it's so useful for so many different things that are applicable on Earth. So what we decided to do at DSI is basically we're offering research opportunities for everyone around the world, regardless of their resources, their passports, and all of it. And we've grown to a community of over 300 people from over 60 countries in one company. So you can imagine that the demand is there, and we're needing more and more people to work on it. And there's so many things being done in the field that we're really, really trying to push for it.
She saw me hovering to get the mic back. I'm going to pass it back, I promise. So just because you touched upon a couple of very important points, and one is, of course, overall governance and the governance structure, and there's a bit of an oxymoron, maybe just to provide a bit more background, because, for example, just a couple of years ago, there's laws that were enacted in Luxembourg, but also in the US, which allow for private extraction of resources on the moon. And once you extract it, it's yours. Yet, of course, no one is allowed to own any property or space on the moon. But so ultimately, it still means if you're the fastest and you get to the moon first and you start extracting resources, hypothetically speaking, they're yours, and then it's your decision whether you're going to use that to advance your own country's ultimately economic gains, or whether you're going to share these resources with others. So we spoke a little bit about the overall legal framework and the reform of that is needed. The inclusion of course, private actors and the huge economic opportunity that exists, which is, in bottom line, of course, very, very positive, but that needs to be entered into, ultimately, the legal framework. So maybe I'll pass over to Ritu again, and then back to you when it comes to sort of, the perspective from India and then lunar laws overall.
Yes, Corina, as you rightly told, we have this Outer Space Treaty 1967, which forbids, any nation's claim on the lunar surface or any celestial body. But then it is still needs to be really revamped, because it doesn't addresses about, as you told, the corporate claims or the private players going there, how they have to be regulated, and all those aspects are not yet addressed, and it needs to be revamped. And then we have something called Artemis Accord, but then we see that some countries are not part of it. Russia and China are not part of it. So we have to have really, UN-backed or a common global, space framework, which is urgently needed. As you told, somebody going there and getting the resources, I would like to just tell the technical part of it. When you try to go to lunar surface or to moon, one of the very important resources or infrastructure which is required is the ground stations, the ground antennas, which are required to communicate when we go to moon surface or in any celestial Mars or any other body. And then because we know Earth is rotating and we cannot have a single ground station which can support throughout the mission life. So all these ground stations are actually spread across the globe, and currently we are for some of the ground stations are part of South America. Some of stations are in Arab part of world, and then some are in Australia. So they are all scattered or spread across the globe. They also make the part of your mission. When you have a mission, you are using the resources or the infrastructure which is spread across the globe. So when you reach to moon and then your team is working, which team also is belonging to different parts of world, any private sector, if you see, people are there from different parts of world. So when your team is so diverse, you are utilizing the resources or this infrastructure which is spread across the globe. When we go to moon, nobody can claim, it's very, very, this one, how can you claim the moon or the part of the moon is somebody else's? It's a part of cosmos and we are very, very tiny part of it. So we have to understand that we are working together, whether it's a private player or it's a government or national agencies. Their big team is working together, which is comprising of the people, diverse areas, and then infrastructure, as I told. So when we get the resources, it's a common resource, a shared resource for all of us. We need to really have, as you mentioned, a framework is really missing, which needs to say that how those resources which are getting collected or by someone, how it can be shared or, for a whole humanity. That is what is missing. I also agree with that. But we need to really address it because in cosmos, nothing belongs to a single person. It's all for for humanity. So that is a bigger perspective we need to see and then bring the framework out. Yes.
Maybe let's bring Jessica, just for a very quick comment, bring you into this. So how do we balance private competition, which is very much needed, private investment, which is very much needed, the drive for innovation, with ultimately the framework that exists for global cooperation?
Yeah, I think that we talk a lot about the lack of framework right now, and it's true that what we have is the Outer Space Treaty, which of course was signed in 1967 at the height of the Cold War. It's really a Cold War relic document, and it provides this kind of incredible inspirational framework for space activities, but what it doesn't provide is details about how to go about the actual coordination in practice. And when the Outer Space Treaty was signed, the prevalence of private activity was very low. And what we now see happening is that because the cost of access to space has gone down so significantly, we see a vast diversity of actors that are interested in and being funded to go to the moon. And most of that funding is actually still coming from governments. So when we talk about the $500 billion space economy that is projected, actually we're not talking about
lunar economy.
Pardon?
Just lunar economy. Space economy will be much larger, but 500 billion lunar.
1.8 trillion by 2035. Thank you. So for lunar economy, what we're really looking at is government to private sector contracts at the moment. Most private sector activities in general are also governed under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. So they are what's called under the authorization and continuing supervision of the governments from which they're launched. So coming back to the notion of frameworks, one of the things that has come up a lot at this conference is the notion of multilateral versus plurilateral versus minilateral. And I think that there's a real opportunity for us to make better use of plurilateral fora in order to bring together actors that have shared interests and bring kind of a more of a bottom-up strategy for coordination and standards, and have those initiatives come together in much more of a kind of polycentric manner, rather than attempting to kind of only go with a multilateral kind of everybody all at once homogeneous framework. And that's something that is being discussed. There are a number of different initiatives internationally and regionally from beyond the Outer Space Treaty. We have the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space at the United Nations, but we also have things like the ITU regulates spectrum and orbital slots. We have the Artemis Accords and ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station. These are kind of regional block initiatives, as well as you have civil society and sort of think tanks and the policy community putting out proposals that are being discussed in smaller groups. So I think there are initiatives happening, but I do think it's really important that we actually be willing to come to the table and discuss them, because at the end of the day, policy is a human-invented activity that is up to us to reflect the kinds of values that you're talking about. And so, we just need to kind of get to work and come to the table on it.
Absolutely. And ultimately, though, and I want to pass for one comment back to Sarah and then open the floor for questions. We'll have about 8 minutes for questions then. But obviously, every country has an interest in space, should have an interest in space. Not everyone has the capital necessarily or the launch capabilities to launch their own satellites into space. Where do you view, especially from a more emerging market perspective, the, let's say, unique competitive advantages that smaller countries could maybe leverage in order to not miss out?
I think more and more emerging countries are realizing of the importance of space, because when, for instance, we're so dependent on space technology that we're using it literally every single day of our lives. We're so dependent on it. Every single one of you has it on their phones and they're using it. I bet you cannot live one day without using it. You're constantly looking at the weather, the UV on your weather app, your GPS. You're constantly using it. So it's really something that countries and governments are really looking at, having their own, being able to have their own data, rather than keep constantly buying it from either industry or from different governments. Because imagine if you were so dependent on your neighbor for something, you wouldn't have too much agency, or you wouldn't have too much control, and your neighbor would have too much control over you, right? Unfortunately, we should be looking at the world as, yes, we'll definitely always be helping one another, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot more national interest. We're using space to really, as a leverage for national interest, we're using it to increase the power of a country. And, you can use it also too to be part of it. You have to use it to be a part of the taste, to have a seat at the table. So emerging countries are realizing that that's kind of one of the things that, have dictated where humanity is going. So if you look back in history, and I'm going to just very briefly mention in the past, like what happened with the space race between the US and the USSR. And it wasn't just a space race just because one party or both parties wanted to go to space first just because. It wasn't just for exploration. It wasn't just to, let's set foot on the moon, and that's kind of like, that's going to be just for exploration, it's like for science. It wasn't that. It was a competition for ideology. And we're seeing that constantly happening again and again. So if you think about, if you go back in time and you think, what if, the USSR had won? Then the ideology of the most common ideology in the world would be different. The most powerful countries in the world would be different. The way we're perceiving these countries would be different. The countries that are dictating what is right and what's wrong, or like how we should be looking at a country or we should be looking at a different country, would be different. Because it's all dictated by who wins and who has the most amount of power. So in order for us to have an equitable, just to level a little bit the playing field, you have to use space for that. So space is such a strong geopolitical tool that politicians have constantly been using, but we need to be using it more and more in emerging countries, because otherwise we'd be missing out. So we're always talking about the topic of AI, about this, about that. Like, we're seeing how powerful social media is. We're just putting our toes in the water of the AI world. We're just in the 90s compared to what we were in the internet, with the internet back then. So space is the same thing. We have to be a part of it. Otherwise, we'd be missing out. And you'd be losing on this power. And you'd be lagging behind other countries. And you'd be giving up your control over the things that you're so reliant on that is just completely unfair to the people. You know, it always comes back to the people. Governments should serve the people. And therefore, they should serve them in a way where, you know, to give them more agency, to just level things up, to, have all the countries have a seat at the table and making decisions about the future of humanity. Because even if, not everyone, looks at space as like, oh, this is something that we need to definitely work on or cares too much about space, and that's fair. We don't all have to care about it. But we have to realize the importance of its effect on humanity, and that is where we're going. We have to acknowledge that AI is something that we need, that is going to happen, that it's a part of, the future of humanity, but so is space.
Thank you. I just want to give the audience at least the opportunity to ask one or two questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And
hi, ma'am. To your right.
Given the environmental...
hello, ma'am. Greetings. This is Khushi Sharma from Pandit Deen Dayal Energy University, Gujarat. My question is for Ritu, ma'am. As private companies take the lead in space exploration, how can national space agencies like ISRO ensure that emerging economies retain equitable access to space rather than becoming dependent on corporate-controlled infrastructure and technologies? Thank you.
Yeah, yes, Krushi, that's what I was referring in the first part of my this one. So it is like when, as I told, when we have the technology and when the technology has to reach to masses and the services have to reach to masses, it's a single entity or government entity cannot fulfill all the requirements, and there is a need to have a private players, there is a need to have privatization. And privatization does not mean that there is some danger or something. It's like we have to see this is the requirement of a common man to meet day to day, even regular. If you see it currently, the requirement is so huge. We have to, and we don't have so much of resources to fulfill. So we have to bring in the private players. But then when you bring them and when you talk of privatization, there, as I told, there are many startups are coming up. There are many, right now that like Skyroot and Agnikul. They are very, very in the initial phase. They are very successful, and they are going to support you. I mean, it's not that they're going to pose any danger. They're going to support you. The whole economy going to build up. It's going to grow. So we have to only ensure that there is a proper framework or proper, policies which are, getting properly formulated and then also followed by these players and the government anyhow.
Thank you.
To that. So we have the Indian space policy in place which does all that. So we need not to get afraid of that. It's going to really boost your economy, boost your common man's life, improve the quality of the common man's life. So it's that way, yeah.
Thank you, Ritu. Let's take one more question. Short question, very short answer.
Izzy from New Zealand. Given the environmental impact of rocket launches and satellite proliferation, how are tech leaders balancing rapid innovation with planetary sustainability, specifically beyond traditional offsetting mechanisms, which we know have significant limitations towards systemic and direct contributions to climate and the environment?
Good question. I think that one of the things that's really important for us to do is to acknowledge the impacts of the activities that we undertake. And so there isn't a way at the moment to erase that environmental impact, but I think it's also important to recognize the benefits that we do receive from putting satellites in space and the particular value to the environmental community and our ability to understand and monitor the planet. I think personally is greater than the cost, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to think about some of the topics that Ritu was talking about in terms of space debris is a massive environmental issue, disposal, how we dispose of satellites, how we ensure that we don't have satellites colliding with each other and creating space debris. I think that's actually the bigger environmental issue in terms of like net impact. But I do think it's important that we talk about the sort of atmospheric impacts of launches as well. Not to mention debris from like rocket debris falling back down to Earth is another significant one that's more dramatic, if perhaps less like sort of net environmentally impactful.
And just to really quickly add here that there's a lot of technologies that we're developing for space that can be used to solve some of our issues on Earth. So it's really important to notice that they can be applicable directly to solve problems on Earth if we have the finances and if we have the political will. And that's what we're doing at Strive, which, if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about it.
Ma'am,
Thank you. Time's
on your
up.
left.
I know.
Hi.
So if you want to come find us and continue the conversation, the panel will be outside. Thanks, everyone.